My dad yelled, "Stop," when the priest asked if anyone objected during my wedding. My dad, Terry, always had to be the center of attention at every event with his stupid jokes that only he found funny, while everyone else just felt uncomfortable and embarrassed. At my cousin's wedding, he pretended to choke during the vows to get laughs, but just disrupted the entire ceremony. At my college graduation, he yelled, "That's my baby," when I walked across the stage, even though they specifically asked parents to hold applause until the end. At my engagement party, he gave a 40-minute speech about how I used to eat dirt as a child and wet the bed until I was 9, which weren't even true stories, just things he made up for entertainment. My mom always defended him, saying that's just how your father shows love through humor, but it wasn't humor. It was him needing every single moment to be about him. When I got engaged to Oliver, I sat my dad down and explicitly told him he needed to behave at my wedding. No jokes during the ceremony, no embarrassing speeches, no pranks, no surprises, nothing that would take attention away from Oliver and me on our day. He rolled his eyes and said I was being bridezilla already, and couldn't I take a joke? I said this wasn't about taking a joke. It was about having one day that wasn't ruined by his need for attention. He promised to be good, but kept making comments about how boring weddings were without some entertainment. The wedding planning was exhausting because I had to account for every possible way Dad might try to make himself the star. I assigned my brother Keith to basically babysit him. I gave the DJ strict instructions not to give him the microphone unless approved. I told the photographer to avoid candid shots of him because he'd definitely be doing something stupid in the background. I even considered not inviting him, but Mom said that would destroy our family, and she'd never forgive me. The morning of the wedding, Dad was suspiciously well behaved. He got dressed without complaint, didn't make jokes during photos, and actually seemed to be taking it seriously. I started to relax, thinking maybe he'd finally understood this wasn't about him. Oliver and I had planned a beautiful traditional ceremony at my grandmother's church, where my parents had also gotten married. We had 200 guests all dressed formally, and the atmosphere was perfect. Everything was going smoothly until we got to that part of the ceremony. The pastor said, "If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." And there was the normal silent pause where everyone waits for the ceremony to continue. Then my dad stood up and yelled, "Stop, I object," in the loudest voice possible. The entire church gasped. Oliver's face went white. My mom grabbed Dad's arm, trying to pull him down. The pastor looked confused and asked, "Sir, what is your objection?" Dad started laughing and said, "Just kidding, wanted to see everyone's faces." Gotcha. He was the only one laughing. 200 people sat in stunned silence. Oliver's grandmother actually started crying. My teenage cousin recorded the whole thing looking shocked. The pastor didn't know what to do and just stood there frozen. Dad kept laughing and said, "Come on, that was hilarious, you should see your faces. Lighten up, people, it's a wedding, not a funeral." I stood at the altar in my wedding dress, watching my father ruin the most important moment of my life for a joke that wasn't even funny. Oliver whispered to me, asking if we should continue, but his voice was shaking. His parents looked horrified. His sister was covering her mouth in shock. All of our friends were whispering to each other. The moment was completely destroyed. The pastor tried to recover by saying, "Well, if there are no real objections, let's continue," but the damage was done. The sacred feeling was gone. Everyone was uncomfortable. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, the kiss felt awkward because everyone was still processing what had happened. Instead of joyful celebration, there was confused murmuring as we walked back down the aisle. At the reception, Dad was going around trying to high-five people for his hilarious prank, but everyone was avoiding him. Oliver's best man, Connor, pulled me aside and said that was the most disrespectful thing I've ever seen at a wedding. Oliver's mother was in tears, telling her sister she couldn't believe someone would do that to their own daughter. My mom was trying to do damage control, but people were disgusted. Then Dad grabbed the microphone during dinner before the official speeches and said everyone needs to relax, it was just a joke. You're all acting like I murdered someone. Learn to laugh a little. That's when Oliver stood up and took the microphone from him. He said, "Terry, what you did wasn't funny, it was cruel. You took the most sacred moment of our ceremony and made it about yourself. You embarrassed your daughter, humiliated your family, and disrespected everyone here. Since you clearly don't understand appropriate behavior, you need to leave. Now." Dad started arguing, saying Oliver couldn't kick him out of his own daughter's wedding. But Oliver said, "Watch me." Terry opened his mouth to argue more, but Oliver was already turning away from him and scanning the room until he spotted Samuel standing near the kitchen doors. Oliver walked straight over to Samuel, and I could see him speaking firmly while pointing back at Terry. Samuel's face went from confused to uncomfortable as he nodded and started walking toward my father. Terry was still standing there with that stupid grin on his face, like this was all part of the joke, when Samuel reached him and touched his arm gently. Samuel said something quiet that I couldn't hear, but Terry pulled his arm away and said loud enough for nearby tables to hear that this was ridiculous, and he wasn't going anywhere. Samuel kept his voice low and professional, asking Terry to please come with him to discuss the situation privately. Terry looked around at the guests staring at him, and his grin finally started to fade. I stood there in my wedding dress, feeling like I was watching this happen to someone else, because how could this be my wedding day? My hands were shaking, and I couldn't seem to move or think clearly. Connor appeared next to me and leaned in close, asking quietly if I was okay. I looked at him and heard myself say, "I don't know what I am right now, because my father just ruined the most important moment of my life, and my husband is kicking him out on our wedding day. Connor squeezed my shoulder and said he was sorry this was happening. Emily suddenly rushed forward toward Oliver with tears streaming down her face. She grabbed Oliver's arm and started begging him to please reconsider because Terry didn't mean any harm and kicking him out would ruin the family forever. Her voice was getting louder and more desperate as she pleaded. Oliver pulled his arm free and said calmly that Terry already ruined the wedding and he wasn't changing his mind about this. Then Oliver walked over to me and took my hand and asked what I wanted to do. His eyes were searching mine, waiting for my answer. I looked past him at my father, who was now trying to laugh off the whole thing with some guests at a nearby table. He was gesturing with his hands and grinning while they sat there, avoiding eye contact with him, clearly uncomfortable. One woman actually turned her chair away from him. Something inside me just broke watching him still trying to make this funny after destroying my ceremony. I looked back at Oliver and said Terry needs to leave because I can't celebrate my marriage with someone who deliberately humiliated me in front of everyone I love. Oliver nodded and squeezed my hand. Terry must have heard me because his face changed completely. The amused expression disappeared and shock took its place as he realized I was serious and agreeing with Oliver. He walked toward us saying I was overreacting just like I always do and couldn't I take a simple joke. But his voice sounded less confident now and his eyes kept darting between Oliver and me. He said, "Come on, sweetie. You know I was just having fun and everyone needs to lighten up." I didn't respond and just stood there holding Oliver's hand. Then Keith stepped up from where he'd been sitting and positioned himself next to me. Keith looked at Terry and said he needed to go quietly before this got worse. Terry spun toward Keith with his mouth open and said, "Whose side are you on anyway?" Keith said he was on his sister's side because what Terry did was cruel, and he was tired of making excuses for him. Terry's face went red and he started to say something, but Samuel stepped in again. Samuel put a hand on Terry's elbow and said firmly, but gently, that it was time to leave now. Emily was still crying, and she hurried over to follow them as Samuel guided Terry toward the exit. Terry kept trying to turn around and argue, but Samuel kept him moving forward. Emily was saying something to Terry that I couldn't make out through her crying, and she kept looking back at me with this betrayed expression. Terry said loudly enough for people to hear that he had nothing to apologize for, because it was just a joke, and everyone else was too sensitive. Several guests turned away or looked down at their plates. The whole reception hall went silent, except for the sound of Emily crying, and Terry's voice getting farther away. Everyone was watching them leave, and I could hear whispers starting at different tables. Oliver's relatives were looking at each other with these shocked expressions like they couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. Some of my cousins were whispering behind their hands. The DJ had stopped the music and was just standing there unsure what to do. Then Lori came over and pulled me into a hug. She said she was so sorry this happened and I didn't deserve this on my wedding day. I felt tears starting, but I blinked them back because I didn't want to cry in front of 200 people. After Terry and Emily finally left through the main doors, Oliver and I just stood there together not knowing what to do next. The reception was supposed to continue with dinner and dancing, but the mood was completely destroyed. Guests were looking at us waiting to see what would happen. Connor came back over and suggested quietly that Oliver and I take a 15-minute break in the bridal suite to collect ourselves. He said he would ask the DJ to play some music and encourage guests to visit the bar so people wouldn't just sit there in awkward silence. Oliver looked at me and I nodded because I needed to get out of that room. We walked toward the bridal suite with everyone watching us, and I kept my head up even though I wanted to hide. Once we were inside with the door closed, I finally broke down crying. Oliver pulled me against him and held me while I sobbed into his shoulder. He said he was sorry he had to kick my father out, but he couldn't let Terry treat me that way. I pulled back enough to look at him and said he did the right thing, and I was grateful he stood up for me when my own mother wouldn't. Oliver wiped tears off my face with his thumbs and said we were a team now and he would always protect me. I leaned against him again and cried harder because my wedding day was ruined, but at least I married someone who actually loved and respected me enough to defend me when it mattered most. Someone knocked on the bridal suite door and Bianca called out asking if she could come in. Oliver looked at me and I nodded, so he opened the door. Bianca walked in carrying my makeup bag and set it on the vanity. She came over and hugged me tight, then pulled back to look at my face. She said my mascara was running down my cheeks and she'd help me fix it before we went back out to the reception. I sat down at the vanity while she opened the makeup bag and started pulling out products. She wiped under my eyes with a makeup remover wipe and reapplied concealer where my foundation had smudged from crying. While she worked on my face, she told me that what Oliver did out there was the most romantic thing she'd ever seen in her life. She said he protected me without even thinking about it and didn't care what anyone thought, including our parents. That's what marriage is supposed to be, she said. Two people who have each other's backs no matter what. I felt tears starting again, but Bianca told me to stop or she'd have to redo everything. Oliver stood behind us watching in the mirror and squeezed my shoulder. My phone buzzed on the vanity and I picked it up to see a text from Keith. He said Emily took Terry home and they were both mad as hell. Emily was threatening not to come back to the reception at all. I texted back saying that was her choice to make. But I wasn't going to apologize for finally enforcing boundaries that Terry had ignored my entire life. Keith responded immediately saying he knew and he supported me completely. Another text came through from Emily asking how I could do this to my father on my wedding day. I showed Oliver and he said to ignore it for now. We could deal with Emily later, but right now we needed to get back out there and try to salvage our reception. Bianca finished fixing my makeup and stepped back to check her work. She said I looked beautiful again, and no one would be able to tell I'd been crying. I stood up and smoothed down my dress. Oliver took my hand, and we walked toward the door together. When we came back into the reception hall about 20 minutes after Terry left, I was worried everyone would still be sitting there in awkward silence. But Connor had somehow managed to shift the whole mood of the room. Music was playing from the DJ booth, and people were standing at the bar talking and laughing. Connor saw us come in and walked over with a big smile. He said he got people drinking and started some conversations to break the tension. Several guests noticed we were back and came over to us privately. Oliver's aunt pulled me aside and said she completely supported our decision to remove Terry. She said what he did was totally wrong and she was glad Oliver stood up for me. One of my cousins came over and told Oliver he did the right thing and everyone understood why Terry had to leave. Another guest said Terry's behavior was the most inappropriate thing they'd ever witnessed at a wedding ceremony. Person after person approached us to express support and say they were on our side. I started to feel less alone in the situation, knowing that most of our guests understood what happened and didn't blame us for our reaction. The DJ announced it was time for the father of the groom speech, and Brian walked up to take the microphone. He stood there for a moment looking out at everyone, then his eyes found Oliver and me at our table. He said he wanted to talk about what just happened, because everyone saw it, and pretending it didn't happen would be weird. He said he was incredibly proud of Oliver for being the kind of man who protects his wife and stands up for what's right even when it's hard. He said marriage is about being a team and having your partner's back, especially when family makes that difficult. He talked about how he raised Oliver to respect women and treat his partner as an equal, and he was glad to see those values in action tonight. The guests started applauding, and Brian had to wait for them to quiet down. He said he and Lori were thrilled to welcome me into their family, and they would always support us as a couple. When he finished, the whole room erupted in loud applause, and several people stood up. Oliver squeezed my hand under the table, and I could see his eyes were wet. Then Lori took the microphone and gave her mother of the groom speech. She talked about raising Oliver to understand that respect and kindness matter more than anything else. She said she taught him that a real man protects the people he loves and stands up against behavior that hurts them. She looked directly at me and said she was so happy he married someone who deserved that kind of respect and protection. She welcomed me to their family with such real warmth in her voice that I started crying again despite Bianca's makeup work. Lori said their family was built on the idea that you choose to treat each other well every single day, and they were excited to have me as part of that. She talked about how proud she was of both of us for handling a terrible situation with grace. When she finished and handed the microphone back to the DJ, everyone applauded again, and Lori came over to hug me tight. She whispered that I was her daughter now, and she'd always have my back just like Oliver did. Connor took the microphone next for his best man speech, and I was grateful he kept it funny and sweet without being mean or embarrassing. He told stories about Oliver in college that were amusing but respectful. He talked about Oliver's loyalty and how once you were his friend, he would do anything for you. He said Oliver had more honesty than anyone he knew and would always tell you the truth even when it was uncomfortable. Connor said those exact qualities made Oliver perfect for me, because I clearly needed someone with the strength to stand up for what's right. He made a joke about how he thought Oliver was going to tackle Terry when he grabbed that microphone and everyone laughed. The whole speech felt like a pointed opposite to what my father would have done if he'd been allowed to speak. Connor focused on building Oliver up instead of tearing him down with fake embarrassing stories. When he finished, he raised his glass and said, "Here's to a marriage built on respect and protection," and everyone drank to that. During dinner, I noticed Oliver's grandmother making her way slowly over to our table using her cane. She sat down in the empty chair next to me and patted my hand. She said she wanted me to know she supported what we did tonight. Then she told me a story about her own wedding 60 years ago, when her uncle got drunk and made a scene during the reception. She said her husband threw him out and half the family didn't speak to them for a year, but it was worth it to set that boundary. Another guest came over and shared a similar story about a family member who disrupted their ceremony. A friend of Oliver's parents told me about dealing with a difficult mother-in-law who tried to ruin their wedding photos. Person after person came to our table to express support and share their own experiences with hard family situations at weddings. The stories made me feel less alone, like this wasn't just my problem, but something lots of people dealt with. Each conversation helped me feel more confident that we'd made the right choice, even though it was painful. My phone kept buzzing in my clutch purse under the table. I pulled it out and saw text after text from Emily. She said I was tearing the family apart, and how could I do this to my father who loved me? She said I was being cruel and heartless, and she couldn't believe I'd embarrassed Terry like that in front of everyone. She said I'd regret this decision for the rest of my life. The texts kept coming one after another, getting more intense. Then Keith texted me separately saying to ignore Emily because she was in full mode where she couldn't see how bad Terry's behavior had become. He said she was making excuses like always and couldn't accept that Terry had finally faced real results for his actions. Keith told me he was proud of me for standing up for myself, and he wished he'd done it years ago. I showed the text to Oliver, and he said we should both put our phones away and just focus on enjoying the rest of our reception. He was right, so I turned my phone to silent and tucked it back in my purse. The DJ announced it was time for our first dance, and Oliver led me out to the middle of the dance floor. The lights dimmed and our song started playing. Oliver pulled me close and we started swaying together. He leaned down and whispered in my ear that this was our day, and we weren't going to let Terry's need for attention take that away from us. He said we handled it together as a team, and that's how our whole marriage would be. I realized he was right, and something shifted inside me. I stopped thinking about Terry and Emily and all the drama. I focused on Oliver and the fact that I just married someone who would actually fight for me when it mattered. I started to really enjoy the moment instead of just surviving it. When the song ended, everyone applauded and other couples joined us on the dance floor. I was actually smiling for real now instead of forcing it. During the dancing, several of Oliver's college friends came over to talk to us. One of them said he honestly thought Oliver was going to punch Terry in the face when he grabbed that microphone. Another friend said he'd never seen Oliver that protective or angry in all the years they'd known him. They told me I was lucky to have someone who would stand up for me like that without hesitation. One friend said most guys would have tried to smooth things over to avoid conflict, but Oliver went straight to defending me. They kept talking about how impressed they were with how Oliver handled the whole situation. I looked at Oliver and saw him getting a little embarrassed by all the attention, but also proud. His friends were right, though. I was lucky to marry someone with enough backbone to create conflict when protecting me required it. About 20 minutes later, while Oliver and I were standing near the dessert table talking to some of his college roommates, my teenage cousin came up looking nervous and holding her phone. She asked if she could talk to me privately for a second, and we stepped away from the group. She held up her phone showing the video of Terry's disruption, and asked if I wanted her to delete it because she felt bad about recording such an awful moment. I looked at the screen and saw Terry standing up yelling and the shocked faces of all the guests. I told her to absolutely keep that video and send it to me because I had a feeling Emily would start telling her own version of what happened, and I might need proof of what actually went down. My cousin nodded and said she'd text it to me right away, then gave me a quick hug before heading back to her table. Oliver asked what that was about, and I explained about the video. He said that was smart thinking because his mom had already mentioned that Emily was going around the reception trying to convince people that Terry's joke was harmless and everyone overreacted. As the night kept going, something strange started happening. The reception actually became fun. People were dancing and laughing and celebrating without that constant worry in the back of everyone's mind about what Terry might do next. The DJ played great music and guests were out on the dance floor having a genuinely good time. I was dancing with Oliver's sister and some of my friends from college, and I realized I was actually enjoying myself at my own wedding reception. It hit me that this was the first family event in years where I wasn't spending the whole time anxious and stressed about my father's behavior. Every other wedding or party or gathering I'd attended with Terry there had involved me constantly watching him and waiting for the next embarrassing moment. But now with him gone, I could just be present and happy. I could dance without worrying he'd cut in and make some inappropriate joke. I could talk to guests without wondering if he was behind me doing something stupid for attention. The relief was so intense I almost started crying again, but this time from something other than sadness. During a slow song, Keith found me and asked if we could talk for a minute. We walked over to a quieter corner of the reception hall and he looked really upset. He started apologizing for not stopping Terry before the ceremony happened. He said he'd been watching Dad all morning and everything seemed fine, so he let his guard down during the actual ceremony. He felt terrible that he'd failed at the one job I'd given him. I put my hand on his arm and told him it wasn't his fault at all. Terry is a grown adult who makes his own choices, and Keith couldn't have known he'd do something that awful. I said I was just grateful that Keith supported me when it mattered by backing up Oliver's decision to kick Terry out. Keith hugged me and said he was proud of me for finally standing up to Dad, and he wished he'd done it years ago. He admitted he'd been making excuses for Terry's behavior just like Emily did, because it was easier than dealing with the conflict. But watching Terry ruin my ceremony and then refuse to apologize made Keith realize how toxic the whole family dynamic had become. We went back to the dance floor and I felt closer to my brother than I had in a long time. Near the end of the reception around 10:30, Samuel came over to where Oliver and I were sitting taking a break from dancing. He asked if he could speak with us for a moment and we said of course. Samuel told us he'd been managing events at this venue for 15 years, and what Terry did was honestly one of the most disrespectful things he'd ever witnessed at a wedding. He said he'd seen drunk guests and family drama and all kinds of chaos, but a father deliberately disrupting his own daughter's ceremony as a prank was a new low. He told us we handled the situation with grace and dignity, and he was truly sorry our ceremony had been ruined like that. Oliver thanked him for his support and for helping escort Terry out without making an even bigger scene. Samuel said it was his job, and he was just glad we were able to salvage the reception and still have a good celebration. He shook both our hands and said he hoped the rest of our marriage would be much smoother than our wedding day. At 11 o'clock, Oliver and I said goodbye to our remaining guests and headed out to his car. We'd booked a hotel suite downtown for our wedding night before flying out for our honeymoon in 2 days. The drive was only about 20 minutes, but as soon as we got in the car and closed the doors, I completely broke down. All the emotions I'd been holding in during the reception came flooding out, and I sobbed while Oliver drove. He reached over and held my hand and let me cry without trying to make me stop or tell me everything was okay. When we got to the hotel and went up to our suite, I was still crying on and off. Oliver sat down next to me on the bed and said we were going to build our own family traditions that didn't include tolerating disrespect from anyone. He said our kids would grow up seeing what healthy boundaries looked like, and they'd never have to deal with the kind of behavior Terry thought was acceptable. He told me he loved me, and he was sorry my father ruined our ceremony, but he was proud of how strong I was. We stayed up talking until almost 2 a.m. about everything that happened and what we wanted our marriage and future family to look like. I fell asleep feeling sad about my dad, but also safe knowing Oliver would always protect me. The next morning, I woke up around 9 and checked my phone, which I'd left on silent overnight. There were dozens of texts and missed calls from Emily. I scrolled through them, and they got progressively more intense. The first few were asking me to call her. Then they turned angry, saying I was tearing the family apart. Then guilt-tripping messages about how I embarrassed Terry in front of everyone. Then pleading messages begging me to forgive my father who loved me so much. There were also several voicemails that I didn't listen to because I could guess what they said. Oliver woke up and saw me looking at my phone with a stressed expression. He asked what was wrong, and I showed him all the messages from Emily. He suggested we turn off our phones completely and just enjoy our mini honeymoon before we had to deal with all the family drama. He said we deserved at least one day of peace after everything that happened yesterday. I agreed, and we both powered off our phones and spent the whole day in the hotel suite ordering room service and watching movies and pretending the outside world didn't exist. It was exactly what I needed. 3 days later, when we finally turned our phones back on and checked our messages, there were over 50 texts from Emily. I sat on the couch in our apartment and read through them with Oliver next to me. They ranged from angry messages calling me selfish and cruel, to guilt-tripping ones about family loyalty, to pleading ones begging me to just talk to her. But there wasn't a single message from Terry. Not one text or call or voicemail. That somehow hurt worse than his disruption of the ceremony, because it showed he still didn't think he'd done anything wrong. If he felt any remorse at all, he would have reached out to apologize, but his silence made it clear he thought everyone else was the problem. Oliver saw my face and asked what was wrong. I told him Terry hadn't contacted me once, and he said that told me everything I needed to know about whether my father was capable of change. My phone rang, and it was Keith calling. I answered, and he sounded stressed. He told me Emily had been calling every single relative we had, giving them her version of events. She was telling people that Oliver was cruel and unreasonable for kicking Terry out over a harmless joke. She said I was being dramatic and vindictive and turning the family against my own father. Keith said several relatives had reached out to him asking what really happened, because Emily's story didn't make sense. They wanted to know if Oliver actually physically threw Terry out, or if there was more to it than what Emily was saying. I felt my anger rising as Keith talked. Of course, Emily was rewriting history to make Terry look like the victim. That's what she always did. I told Keith I was going to set the record straight. After I hung up with him, I sat down at my laptop and opened my email. I wrote a detailed message to my entire extended family explaining exactly what happened. I described Terry's history of attention-seeking behavior at family events. I talked about the explicit conversation I had with him before the wedding asking him to behave. I explained how he stood up during the ceremony and yelled that he objected as a prank. I described how he refused to apologize and kept insisting it was hilarious. I detailed how he grabbed the microphone at the reception to tell everyone to lighten up. I explained that Oliver asked him to leave because his behavior was disrespectful and cruel. Then I attached the video my cousin had sent me so they could see Terry's disruption for themselves and make their own judgment about whether it was a harmless joke. I read the email 3 times to make sure it was clear and factual without being emotional or mean. Oliver read it too and said it was perfect. I hit send and watched it go out to about 30 relatives. Within an hour, the responses started coming in. My aunt said she'd witnessed Terry's behavior at other events and completely understood why we had to remove him. My uncle apologized for not speaking up before about how uncomfortable Terry's jokes made everyone. My grandmother said she was proud of me for standing up for myself. Cousin after cousin sent messages saying they'd seen the video and Terry's behavior was completely inappropriate. Several people said they were sorry I had to deal with that on my wedding day. A few admitted they'd stopped inviting Terry to their events because they couldn't trust him to behave. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, and it felt good to know that most of my family saw the situation clearly and weren't buying Emily's false narrative about Oliver being the bad guy. That night my phone rang showing Emily's number, and I almost didn't answer, but Oliver said I should get it over with. I picked up, and Emily was already crying before I even said hello. She told me I had turned the entire family against Terry with that email, and how could I do this to my own father? I stayed calm and said I simply told the truth about what happened at my wedding. She said I made Terry look like a monster when he was just trying to have fun and lighten the mood. I told her that if the truth makes Terry look bad, that's because his behavior was bad, not because I was being unfair. She cried harder and said I was tearing the family apart, and everyone was calling her asking why Terry would do something so awful. I said maybe she should ask herself why she's been defending his behavior for 30 years instead of holding him accountable. She hung up on me. Oliver squeezed my hand and said I handled that perfectly. The next 2 weeks were quiet, with no contact from either of my parents, which honestly felt peaceful. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Terry. It said he was sorry I was offended by his joke, and he didn't mean to upset me on my wedding day. I read it 3 times, feeling my anger rise with each word. He wasn't apologizing for what he did. He was apologizing that I had feelings about what he did. Oliver read it over my shoulder and said that's not a real apology. I agreed and put my phone down without responding. Keith texted asking if I'd gotten Terry's message, and I said yes, but I wasn't responding to a fake apology that blamed me for being offended. Keith said good because Terry needed to learn that non-apologies don't fix anything. A few days later, Oliver suggested we see a counselor to talk through everything that happened. He said the wedding situation was traumatic, and we should process it with a professional before it affected our marriage. I agreed, and we found a therapist who specialized in family issues. At our first session, the counselor asked us to describe what happened, and Oliver let me tell the whole story. The counselor listened carefully, and then said what we did by removing Terry from the reception was setting a healthy boundary. She said too many people tolerate bad behavior from family members because they're afraid of conflict or being labeled as difficult. She told us that boundaries aren't mean or cruel. They're necessary for healthy relationships. She gave us strategies for maintaining those boundaries without guilt, including practicing responses to family pressure and recognizing manipulation tactics. Oliver and I both felt validated leaving that session. Keith called me a week later sounding tired. He said he'd had a long conversation with Emily about how she enabled Terry's behavior for years. I asked how it went, and Keith said Emily got defensive at first. She insisted Terry meant well and everyone was too sensitive. Keith told her he was done pretending Terry's behavior was acceptable, and it had damaged his relationship with both of us. Emily cried and said Keith was turning against his own parents. Keith said he wasn't turning against anyone, but he refused to participate in making excuses for someone who hurt people and never faced consequences. I told Keith I was proud of him for standing up to her. He said it was hard, but necessary. A month after the wedding, I came home to find a letter in the mailbox with Terry's handwriting. My stomach dropped as I opened it. The letter was full of excuses and justifications about how he was just trying to make people laugh, and weddings are so serious and boring. He went on about how he's always been the fun parent and everyone usually loves his jokes. Then near the end, there was one sentence that said he regrets the misunderstanding at our wedding. Not that he regretted his actions. Not that he was sorry for disrupting the ceremony. He regretted the misunderstanding. I showed Oliver and he shook his head. He said this letter was clearly written because Emily made him do it. I agreed because Terry would never write a letter on his own. We sat at the kitchen table discussing what to do next. Oliver asked if I wanted to accept this weak apology and let Terry back into our lives with strict boundaries. I said I didn't know if boundaries would work with someone who didn't think they did anything wrong. Oliver suggested we could maintain distance until Terry showed genuine remorse. I thought about it and realized we needed something more structured. I said we should require family therapy with a professional mediator before we'd even consider reconciliation. Oliver liked that idea because a therapist would be able to see through Terry's manipulation and call out his behavior patterns. I called Emily the next day and told her we'd received Terry's letter. She sounded hopeful and asked if we could all get together for dinner. I said no, but we would be willing to do family therapy with a professional counselor. Emily was thrilled and said yes immediately. I could tell she thought the therapist would take Terry's side and tell me I overreacted. I gave her the name of a family therapist, and Emily said she'd set it up right away. When I talked to Emily a few days later, she said Terry had reluctantly agreed to go. She put him on the phone, and Terry said this was a waste of money and everyone was being too sensitive, but he'd go to make Emily happy. I said we'd see him at the first session and hung up. The therapy office was small and uncomfortable when Oliver and I arrived for the first session. Terry and Emily were already there, sitting on the couch looking tense. The therapist introduced herself and explained how family therapy worked. She started asking Terry questions about his behavior patterns at family events. Terry was defensive from the start. He said he liked making people laugh, and there was nothing wrong with that. The therapist asked if people usually laughed at his jokes. Terry hesitated and said some people did. She asked him to think about the reactions he typically got. Terry got quiet and then said people sometimes seemed uncomfortable, but that was because they didn't get his sense of humor. The therapist gently pointed out that his jokes consistently came at other people's expense. She said it seemed like his humor was designed to get attention, rather than create genuine connection with his family. Terry's face got red and he argued that wasn't true. Emily jumped in defending him, saying he was just playful and fun. The therapist asked Emily how she felt when Terry made jokes that embarrassed their children. Emily looked uncomfortable and said she wished he wouldn't sometimes, but it was just his personality. We scheduled a second session for the following week. When we came back, Terry was even more defensive than before. The therapist asked him about his childhood and whether he felt overlooked or invisible growing up. Terry said he didn't want to talk about his childhood. The therapist said she noticed a pattern where Terry needed to be the center of attention at important family moments. She suggested he might have narcissistic tendencies and used humor to avoid real emotional intimacy with his family. Terry stood up immediately and said this was garbage. He told the therapist she didn't know what she was talking about and he wasn't paying someone to insult him. Emily tried to calm him down, but Terry was already heading for the door. Emily looked at us with panic in her eyes and then ran after Terry, calling his name. The door slammed and Oliver and I sat there in silence with the therapist. She took a deep breath and said she was sorry that happened, But it wasn't unexpected. She told us privately that Terry showed classic signs of someone who needed to be the center of attention and likely wouldn't change without serious intervention. She said people like Terry rarely admitted they had a problem because that would require them to acknowledge their behavior hurt others. She suggested we focus on our own boundaries and healing, rather than waiting for Terry to have a breakthrough that might never come. Oliver asked if there was any hope Terry would change. The therapist said maybe, but it would take years of individual therapy and genuine willingness to do the work. She said we shouldn't hold our breath waiting for that to happen. We left the session feeling sad but also clear about what we needed to do. I told Oliver in the car that I needed space from both my parents for at least 6 months. He squeezed my hand and said he supported whatever I needed to heal. When we got home, I texted Keith explaining that I was cutting contact with Terry and Emily until they showed real accountability instead of excuses. Keith called me within 5 minutes and said he was doing the same thing. He told me he was tired of watching them hurt me and then act like victims when I set boundaries. Emily started calling both of us repeatedly, but we let the calls go to voicemail. She left messages saying we were tearing the family apart, and how could we be so cruel? I blocked her number after the 10th message because I needed peace, not guilt trips. Oliver's parents invited us to their house for Sunday dinner the following week. Lori hugged me at the door and said she was proud of me for protecting myself. Brian told Oliver privately that cutting off toxic family members was one of the hardest, but most important things a person could do. During dinner, Lori asked if I was okay with all the family drama. I admitted it was hard but necessary. She reached across the table and held my hand while saying that family isn't just about blood, but about people who treat you with love and respect. Oliver's sister Bianca started including me in girls' nights with her friends. Connor and his wife invited us to their lake house for a weekend. Every gathering with Oliver's family felt warm and supportive instead of anxious and unpredictable like events with Terry always were. I realized I'd spent my whole life walking on eggshells waiting for my dad to embarrass me, and now I could finally relax. 3 months after the wedding, I woke up feeling sick and took a pregnancy test that came back positive. I sat on the bathroom floor staring at those 2 lines, and the first thing I thought about was whether I wanted Terry anywhere near my child. Oliver came home from work and found me still sitting there. I showed him the test and he picked me up and spun me around laughing. Then he saw my face and asked what was wrong. I told him I was scared about Terry being a grandfather. We stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about what kind of parents we wanted to be and what kind of grandparents we'd allow around our baby. Oliver said we didn't owe Terry anything just because he was my father. I said I didn't want my child growing up watching Terry make jokes at their expense or feeling anxious at family events like I always did. We agreed that Terry could only have a relationship with our baby if he completed real therapy and showed actual changed behavior over time. Emily called me from a number I didn't have blocked, and I made the mistake of answering. She was crying and saying she missed me. I told her I was pregnant and there was silence on the line. Then she started talking about being a grandmother and asking when she could come visit. I said she and Terry could be part of the baby's life only if Terry got serious help and proved he'd changed. Emily's voice went cold and she said I was being cruel and keeping her from her grandchild over a stupid joke. I told her it wasn't about one joke but about 30 years of behavior and hung up. Keith called that same evening sounding excited. He told me his girlfriend Sarah got engaged and they were planning a spring wedding. I congratulated him and asked if he was going to invite our parents. Keith said he already told Emily that Terry wasn't welcome unless he sincerely apologized to me first for ruining my wedding. Emily apparently started crying and saying that Keith was breaking her heart. Keith told her that watching Terry hurt me broke his heart, so now she knew how it felt. Sarah had witnessed the whole wedding disaster and told Keith she didn't want Terry at their ceremony making it about himself. I felt bad that my situation was affecting Keith's wedding, but he said it was his choice, and he was done enabling Terry's behavior. Emily called Keith every day for a week trying to change his mind. She finally realized that Terry's actions were costing him relationships with both his children, not just me. And 6 months after our wedding, a letter arrived at our house with Terry's handwriting on the envelope. I almost threw it away, but Oliver said I should at least read it. The letter was 2 pages long and actually acknowledged that his behavior was wrong. Terry wrote that he ruined my wedding day and understood why we removed him from the reception. He admitted he'd been selfish and made everything about himself for years. He said he understood if I needed space, but asked if we could start over with whatever boundaries I needed to feel safe. I read the letter 3 times looking for the usual excuses and justifications, but they weren't there. Oliver asked if I thought Terry was serious. I said I didn't know, but I was willing to meet him and find out. I texted Emily saying I'd meet them for coffee with Oliver present, and they needed to understand this was a trial, not a reconciliation. Emily responded immediately saying they'd meet us anywhere, anytime. We chose a coffee shop near our house so we could leave easily if needed. Terry and Emily arrived early and were already sitting at a corner table when we walked in. Terry stood up when he saw us but didn't try to hug me. He looked older somehow and less confident than I'd ever seen him. Emily's eyes were red like she'd been crying. We sat down and nobody spoke for a minute. Then I started talking about how Terry's lifetime of attention-seeking had damaged our relationship and made me dread every family event. I explained that I'd spent years feeling embarrassed and anxious waiting for him to do something inappropriate. Terry listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he said he was sorry, and he knew sorry wasn't enough. He told us he'd been seeing a therapist twice a week since the wedding. The therapist was helping him understand that his need for attention came from feeling invisible as a kid when his parents focused on his older brother. Terry said he'd spent his whole life trying to be noticed and didn't realize he was hurting the people he loved. He admitted it was going to take time to change patterns he'd had for 50 years, but he was trying. Oliver leaned forward and asked Terry directly if he understood that any future disruptions would result in permanent removal from our lives, including our child's life. Terry's face went pale and he asked if I was pregnant. I nodded and said yes, and that's why these boundaries were so important. Terry started crying, which I'd never seen before. He said he didn't want to lose his family over his stupid need to be funny. Emily reached for my hand across the table and I let her take it. She said they'd do whatever we needed and she was sorry for defending Terry instead of protecting me. I told them they could be part of our lives on a trial basis with clear rules. No jokes at other people's expense ever. Respect our boundaries immediately when we set them. Leave events if we ask without arguing. Terry and Emily both agreed without trying to negotiate. Emily cried harder and said thank you for giving them another chance. Terry said he knew he had to earn back our trust, and he was ready to do the work. 6 months later, Keith got married, and I spent the entire ceremony watching Terry for signs of his old behavior. He sat quietly in his seat and didn't make a single joke or try to get attention during the vows. When the pastor got to the part about objections, I held my breath, but Terry just sat there looking down at his hands. At the reception, he asked Keith privately if he could give a speech, and Keith checked with me first before saying yes. Terry stood up with the microphone and talked for maybe 3 minutes about how proud he was of Keith and how happy he was to welcome his new daughter-in-law to the family. He didn't tell embarrassing stories or make it about himself, and when he finished, people actually clapped genuinely instead of out of awkward obligation. Oliver squeezed my hand under the table, and I realized I'd been tense the whole time waiting for Terry to mess up. After the reception, several aunts and uncles came over to tell me how different Terry seemed and how nice it was to actually enjoy a family event without worrying what he might do next. My aunt said she'd been dreading the wedding because of what happened at mine, but this felt like a normal celebration. I stood there listening to them and realized this was what family gatherings were supposed to feel like without the constant anxiety of waiting for Terry to embarrass everyone. I was glad Oliver and I had held firm on our boundaries, even when Emily said we were destroying the family, because clearly it had helped Terry more than years of everyone making excuses for him. 3 months after Keith's wedding, I went into labor, and Oliver called Terry and Emily from the hospital. They showed up an hour after our daughter was born, and Terry stood in the doorway looking nervous, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to come in. Emily walked straight to the bed and asked if she could hold the baby, but Terry hung back by the door. I told him to come meet his granddaughter, and he walked over slowly and took her from Emily with shaking hands. He looked down at her tiny face and started crying, which I'd only seen him do once before at the coffee shop. He told me he was sorry he hadn't been a better father to me when I was growing up, but he wanted to be a good grandfather to her, and he was grateful I was giving him another chance to be part of our family. Oliver stood next to me with his hand on my shoulder, and I could feel him ready to step in if Terry said anything inappropriate, but Terry just held our daughter gently and cried. Emily cried too, and kept saying thank you over and over for letting them be there. They stayed for an hour, and Terry was quiet and respectful the whole time, and left when I said I needed to rest without arguing or trying to stay longer. Over the next year, Terry kept going to therapy twice a week, and his behavior slowly improved in ways that felt real instead of performative. At family dinners, he'd start to tell an embarrassing story about someone, and then stop himself mid-sentence and redirect to something else. At my cousin's baby shower, he began to make a joke about pregnancy, but caught himself and just said congratulations instead. I could see him fighting his old patterns, and the effort showed he was actually trying to change instead of just pretending for a while until things blew over. Emily told me his therapist was helping him understand that real connection came from listening and supporting people, instead of always needing to be the entertaining center of attention. There were still moments where he slipped up, like when he tried to photobomb a family picture, but he apologized immediately instead of laughing it off and saying everyone was too sensitive. When our daughter turned 1, we had a birthday party at our house with both families and close friends. Terry asked me privately before the party if he could give a short speech, and I appreciated that he asked permission first, instead of just grabbing the microphone like he used to. During cake time, he stood up and talked for maybe 2 minutes about how much joy his granddaughter brought to his life, and how proud he was of the parents Oliver and I had become. He kept it short and sweet, and didn't make a single joke at anyone's expense or try to be funny. After he sat down, 3 different relatives pulled me aside separately to tell me how proud they were of the boundaries I'd set, and how those boundaries had helped Terry become someone they actually enjoyed being around instead of someone they tolerated at family events. My uncle said he'd been avoiding family gatherings for years because of Terry's behavior, but now he actually looked forward to them. Keith's wife told me she was grateful because Keith had learned from watching me stand up to Terry, and now their marriage was healthier because he knew how to set boundaries with his own family. A few weeks after the birthday party, Emily asked if she could come over alone to talk. She sat in our living room holding our daughter and told me she was sorry for enabling Terry's behavior for so long and making excuses for him instead of holding him accountable. She admitted she'd been afraid of his reactions if she didn't defend him because he'd get sulky and withdrawn and make her life difficult. She said watching my marriage and seeing how Oliver protected me made her realize what a healthy relationship actually looked like, and she wished she'd had that courage when she was younger. She cried and said she understood now why I'd been so angry for so many years, and she was sorry she'd made me feel like my feelings didn't matter, compared to keeping Terry happy. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I was glad we could rebuild our relationship now that she understood why the boundaries were necessary. She asked if she could babysit sometimes, and I said yes because her behavior had changed along with Terry's, and I could see she was genuinely trying to be a better mother and grandmother. Keith and I talked on the phone almost every week now compared to maybe once a month before the wedding disaster. He told me that watching me stand up to Terry at my wedding gave him courage to set his own boundaries with our parents, and his marriage was stronger because of it. He said his wife had been dealing with her own difficult family members, and seeing how I handled Terry helped her realize she didn't have to tolerate disrespect just because someone was family. Keith admitted he'd spent years being the peacemaker and trying to smooth everything over, but now he understood that real peace came from honest boundaries, not from pretending problems didn't exist. We made plans to get together more often with our spouses, and actually looked forward to family time instead of dreading it. 2 years after our wedding, Oliver surprised me by planning a vow renewal ceremony with just immediate family at a small garden venue. Terry and Emily came, and Terry was perfectly behaved throughout the entire ceremony. He sat quietly during the vows and cried when we exchanged new rings and didn't try to make jokes or get attention. Afterward, he pulled me aside and told me he was grateful I hadn't given up on him completely, despite how badly he'd messed up at our wedding. He said the last 2 years of therapy had taught him that his need for attention had damaged all his relationships, and he was working every day to be better. He thanked Oliver for standing up to him when no one else would, and said he understood now that Oliver was protecting me the way a husband should. Oliver shook his hand and told him he was proud of the work Terry had done to change, and he was glad our daughter would have a grandfather who respected boundaries. Standing there at our vow renewal watching Terry interact appropriately with our family, I realized that while his disruption of our wedding had been horrible in the moment, it had led to necessary changes in our family dynamics that made all our relationships healthier. If Terry hadn't crossed that final line, I might have kept tolerating his behavior for years and taught our daughter that she had to accept disrespect from family members. Oliver's immediate protection that day showed me what real love looked like, and I was grateful for his strength in standing up to Terry when I was too shocked to react. The crisis had forced everyone to confront problems we'd been avoiding for decades, and the result was a family that actually functioned in healthy ways instead of just pretending everything was fine. Our marriage was stronger because we'd faced a major crisis on day one and handled it together as a team instead of letting it divide us. Oliver had shown me immediately that he'd always choose protecting me over keeping peace with difficult people, and that foundation of trust made everything else easier. We'd built our own family traditions based on respect and genuine connection instead of obligation and tolerating bad behavior. We were teaching our daughter through our actions that boundaries were acts of love, not selfishness, and that she never had to accept treatment that made her uncomfortable just because someone was family. When she got older, we'd tell her about what happened at our wedding and how sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important changes. Terry keeps going to his therapy appointments every week and actually does the homework his therapist assigns him. Last month at our daughter's 3rd birthday party, he started to make a joke about her terrible twos, but caught himself mid-sentence and just said she's growing up so fast instead. He asks permission before giving speeches at family events now and keeps them short and focused on the person being celebrated, rather than trying to get laughs. When he visits our house, he respects our rules about screen time and bedtime without making sarcastic comments about us being too strict. He still slips up sometimes, like when he tried to teach our daughter a prank to play on Oliver, but he apologized immediately when I gave him a look and admitted it was old habits coming back. The effort he puts in matters more than perfection, because I can see him actively working to be better, instead of just expecting everyone to tolerate his behavior. Emily transformed into the kind of grandmother I always wished I had growing up. She babysits without trying to undermine our parenting decisions and actually follows our instructions about meals and naps. Last week, she told me she's been seeing her own therapist to work through why she enabled Terry for so long, and she's learning to set boundaries with him too. She pulled me aside at Thanksgiving and said she's proud of the woman I became and wishes she'd had my courage to stand up to Terry when she was younger. She plays with our daughter without making everything about getting attention, and just enjoys being present with her. The relationship we have now feels genuine instead of obligated, and I actually look forward to her visits rather than dreading them. When people ask about our wedding, I tell them the truth without sugarcoating what happened. I explain that my father disrupted the ceremony with an inappropriate joke, but my husband protected me and we removed him from the reception. Most people are shocked, but I add that setting that boundary actually saved our family relationships, because it forced everyone to confront problems we'd been ignoring for years. Some relatives tried to make me feel guilty at first, but I stayed firm, and eventually they admitted they'd been uncomfortable with Terry's behavior at other events too. My cousin, who recorded the whole thing on video, told me last year that watching Oliver stand up to Terry taught her to set boundaries with her own difficult family members. I don't pretend the wedding was perfect, but I also don't let Terry's disruption define our marriage because what matters more is how we handled it together. 3 years after that terrible wedding day, I'm actually happy in ways I didn't think were possible back then. Oliver and I have strong boundaries with both our families, and they respect them because they know we'll enforce consequences if needed. Our daughter is growing up watching her parents treat each other with respect and seeing her grandparents behave appropriately at family gatherings. Terry still isn't perfect, but he's someone I can enjoy spending time with now instead of dreading every interaction. Emily became a loving grandmother who supports us instead of undermining us. Keith and his wife just had their first baby, and they're using the same boundary-setting approach with Terry that worked for us. Our marriage is solid because we faced a crisis on day one and came through it as a team. Terry's stupid joke ended up teaching our whole family what really matters about love and respect, but definitely not in the way he intended when he stood up in that church.